Welcome to Australian Perspectives, Episode 2, Ukraine. Whose war is it really? Researching today's program, I'm firstly amazed what a little bit of digging can unearth, and how different the situation is in Ukraine to the way it's portrayed in our mainstream media. Today we'll take a brief look at some key players in Ukraine in order to gain some basic background knowledge on the situation. Number one on our list of players is, of course, Mr. Zelensky, the sixth and current Ukrainian president. But to gain some insight into how and why this former comedy actor became the leader of such a critically important country to both Western and Russian interests, we must examine who helped put him there. Number one on that list would be a gentleman called Ihor Kolomoisky, pardon me. I'm going to probably struggle with some of these pronunciations, so please forgive me, any native speakers. Mr. Kolomoisky is of three different nationalities, so he holds three passports. He's born in Ukraine, but he also has Israeli and Cypriot citizenship. He's a billionaire banker, oil and media magnate. So Kolomoisky got an early start and some invaluable help, I would say, in kicking off his career when he was younger. With help from the Jewish community of the Dnepropetrovsk, I didn't do very well that time, I don't think, a Jewish community in Dnepropetrovsk, and he co-founded Privatbank in 1992, which was the only bank allowed by the Ukrainian Central Bank to open branches overseas. The Latvian branch of that bank was later implicated in the famous Moldovan bank fraud scandal. In 2010, Kolomoisky acquired the media giant 1+1 Media Group, which operates 8 Ukrainian TV stations. From 2010, Kolomoisky has been under legal pressure from within Ukraine and without. In 2016, Kolomoisky was accused of defrauding Privatbank, which was then Ukraine's largest private bank, of billions of dollars. It was estimated that these crimes cost the Ukraine state at least $5.5 billion US. By 2019, the FBI was investigating Kolomoisky and his mining interests in Ghana and Australia. Prosecution outlined how Kolomoisky had looted billions from Privatbank depositors and, using offshore accounts and shell companies, had funneled the money out of Ukraine and into the US. Kolomoisky was governor of the Dnepropetrovsk Oblast, which is a region, from March 2014 to March 2015. He was sacked by then-President Poroshenko due to conflict between the two over control of the UKRT Trans-NAFTA pipeline, which carried Kolomoisky-owned oil to a Kolomoisky-owned refinery, and thereby cutting out competitors. When Kolomoisky lost control of the state-owned pipeline, he sent a private security force to take control of the UKR Trans-NAFTA headquarters and expel state-appointed management. Now, to go into Kolomoisky's criminal activities would be a long video in itself. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But we'll have a look at some of his media interests. From 2019, Kolomoisky owns 70% of the 1+1 Media Group. This media giant aired Servant of the People, a comedy series in which the now President Volodymyr Zelensky played the Ukrainian president. When Zelensky ran for president, He was regarded by many as Kolomoisky's candidate, and it's been shown that Kolomoisky funded Zelensky's campaign. Zelensky appointed the now exiled Kolomoisky's personal lawyer as his key campaign advisor. Kolomoisky's lawyer made several trips to Geneva, Switzerland and Tel Aviv, Israel, to visit Kolomoisky, who was basically a wanted man in Ukraine. After Zelensky was appointed president, all those officials who were a threat to Kolomoisky were one by one removed from office. After Kolomoisky's blacklisting by the US government in 2019, Zelensky has distanced himself from Kolomoisky, at least in public. Kolomoisky is reported to be a shareholder in a company you may have heard of, and that company is Burisma. Burisma is majority owned by a gentleman by the name of Mykola Zlochevsky. It's a major shareholder in the Sunrise Energy Resources Company, which is a Delaware corporation. Now, some of you may know the significance of that being a Delaware corporation. Delaware is a state in the US, and it's basically a tax haven. So a lot of the Fortune 500 companies, if not all of them, and notably Walmart, which is probably the biggest retailer in the world, they all head their corporations in the state of Delaware, and thereby they avoid paying a lot of tax. So Sunrise owns 2 Ukrainian gas companies, which in turn own exploration licenses. Zlochevsky is the former Minister of Natural Resources in Ukraine, it turns out. This was under the Viktor Yanukovych Ukraine presidency from 2010 to 2014. Just a little bit on Yanukovych is probably worth mentioning. He's actually an Eastern Ukrainian Russian speaker. He fled to Russia in February 2014 and is still wanted in Ukraine. His ethnic origins are Russian, Polish and Belarusian, and he comes from a Catholic family, unlike Mr. Zelensky. Now, Burisma is an energy giant. They're a gas corporation in Ukraine, one of the biggest, and they've had several notable members on its board of directors, including Alexander Kwasniewski, who is former president of Poland. Another notable is Joseph Kofer Black, former director of the Counter-Terrorism Centre of the CIA. This was under the George W. Bush administration, and he's currently still a senior member of the board of directors at Burisma, along with Mr. Kwanevsky, the former president of Poland. Another notable is Devon Archer, former senior advisor to John Kerry for his 2004 presidential campaign. And lastly, we come to Hunter Biden. He was on the board of directors from 2014 to 2019 when his term of a director expired. Now, Burisma Holdings does not disclose its financial details, but its estimated revenue for 2018 was at least US $400 million. Zlochevsky, who owns Burisma, has been under constant international investigation for money laundering since 2014. So we come to Mr. Zelensky himself. He's a Russian speaker as well. He's also, like Mr. Kolomoisky, is from the oblast of Dnipropetrovsk. Born to a Jewish family, his father is a professor and computer scientist and head of the Department of Cybernetics and computing hardware at Kryvyi State University of Economics and Technology. From age 17, Zelensky pursued a career in acting and comedy. He appeared in numerous films and TV productions. He was on the board and a producer of the TV channel Inter from 2010 to 2012. So he's an actor and a comedian by profession. That's pretty telling in itself. In October 2021, the Pandora Papers revealed that Zelensky and his chief aide, the head of the Ukraine Security Service, Ivan Bakhanov, operated a network of offshore companies in the British Virgin Islands, in Cyprus and Belize, whose assets included some very expensive London property. Even for an actor, he seems to have amassed a great deal of wealth. His acting career culminated with his portrayal of the Ukrainian president in the 1+1 Media Group's comedy series Servant of the People. 1+1 Media is of course owned by the aforementioned mining, oil and media magnate and citizen of Israel and Cyprus, Igor Kolomoisky, who was incidentally part of the Dnipropetrovsk Jewish community. Now, given the nature of big business in Ukraine, some of you may be already connecting the dots all the way to the Jewish Khazarian mafia. Some may further conclude that Zelensky is nothing more than a corrupt opportunist, providing the perfect puppet for Khazarian Zionist interests and the ideal token Jew for the Ukrainian Nazis to hide behind. One thing's for sure, like his Canadian counterpart, Justin Trudeau, he will never need to return to his acting career, though this may not even be an option for Trudeau, whose acting career was far less illustrious than Zelensky, until he became Prime Minister of Canada, of course. His acting career has taken off considerably since then, and his performances depicting sincerity are almost convincing, in a soap opera kind of way. Both of these world leaders are part of the new leftist world order movement that inches the Western world ever closer to communism. Now, Russo-Ukrainian relations are extremely complicated. Ukraine was, of course, a Soviet Socialist republic under Soviet rule from Moscow, since their failed attempts at independence were finally crushed by 1922. Ukraine has been occupied by various armies, including Poland, White Russian pro-Tsarists, and finally by the Bolshevists. Western Ukrainians are influenced by Polish, Hungarian and German society, and Eastern Ukrainians tend to identify themselves ethnically as Russians. A major bone of contention in Ukraine is the question of language. As far back as the 19th century, Tsarist Russia sought to marginalise Ukrainian speakers, which has made them fierce adherents to the Ukrainian language, so much so that today the Russian language is under pressure from Kiev and Russian speakers are persecuted. Ukraine gained complete independence from Russia following the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, but this left many ethnically Russian Ukrainians with a border between them and Russia, effectively trapped in Ukraine with a government increasingly hostile towards them. Since the Zelensky government took power in 2014, this hostility has escalated into neo-Nazi groups killing ethnic Russians by shelling with artillery and other forms of terrorism. There are several divides within Ukraine, including which side they fought on in World War II. Many Ukrainians sided with the Nazis in World War II, hoping to be liberated from Bolshevist communism. The SS had their own Ukrainian division, and Ukrainian SS troops were employed in concentration camps and as murder gangs, ridding Poland and Ukraine of Jews due to their association with Bolshevism. These divides run deep in Ukrainian society. So when Mr. Putin speaks of denazification of Ukraine, he means it. Ukrainian military brigades such as the Azov and Kraken brigades are most certainly modern-day Nazis, and they have been given carte blanche to do as they please with ethnically Russian Ukrainians. The inhabitants of Donetsk and Lugansk in eastern Ukraine do not want to be part of a corrupt, hostile and Nazified Ukraine, and have declared themselves independent sovereign republics. They have their own military and provisional government. And after years of failed negotiations between the two fledgling states and Russia and Ukraine, Russia has finally recognised Lugansk and Donetsk as sovereign states. So when Western mainstream media says that Russia's incursion into Ukraine was unprovoked, they are telling barefaced lies. The truth is that Ukraine is being used as a platform by the US to wage war on Russia, whom it intends to destroy. And who's behind that? Well, that's probably for another episode of Australian Perspectives. But be aware that we really have only touched on the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. That those pulling the strings may not be who we think they are, even armed with the preceding information. What we need to be aware of is that governments, including our own, are putting us into more unaffordable debt in order to prop up a corrupt puppet regime in Ukraine, in order to protect investments and money laundering channels of corrupt American crime families and Ukrainian super criminals, as well as carrying out their agenda of destabilising Russia and causing the eventual dissolution of the Russian Federation. That's all for today. We'll continue this with the next episode, and we'll get into a little bit more detail about what's actually happening in Ukraine, about the Russians. We'll look into that a bit more, and we'll look into some of the corruption that just a little bit of digging can expose quite easily. There's a lot of information online. It's all freely available, but you're not going to hear it in the mainstream media. You'll have to look. You've been listening to Australian Perspectives. Thank you very much for your subscriptions and views. If you have any ideas on future episodes, including collaborations, please comment below. Your input is very welcome.